now you know what the lockdown browser is and how it works. You will not have to do the whole rigmarole again for the final exam. Now that it's installed and launched on your computer, for the final, you'll just go right in, hit the launch browser, and then start the test. As far as grading is concerned, as I mentioned, right now your grade, or immediately upon submitting your test, you get a grade that's just the multiple choice. It does not include your short answers. So the grade is low. That's not your ending grade. Jeremy and I are going in and grading the short answer questions kind of periodically. So once you see that you have actual not zeros for your short answer questions, then you can assume your exam is fully graded. The way to check that is not in the grades. You don't go to assessments and grades because that'll just give you whatever score is current. If you go to assessments and exams and click on our exam, like you were going to go in and take it again, then when you click on attempt number 1, your attempt at the test, then it'll show you question by question what you missed, what you got right, and that's where you can see, it'll say, not graded yet for your short answer, or it'll say graded by Jeremy or graded by Lorian Lake Corral. Is there anybody that's been trying to look at their grade and had trouble? Or is there anyone that has any general questions about the exam? All right, awesome. As you now see, right, I hope everyone agrees it wasn't too bad as a test, that it was fairly straightforward, fairly big picture stuff, as long as you're coming to class or watching the recordings and doing the review sheet, you should be fine. The final exam will be the same format as the midterm was. It'll be longer, and it'll cover the whole semester, although it will focus on the second half of class. Everything on the final exam will go on a review sheet, just like we did for this one. So don't worry about that. But now you know what I mean by matching questions and multiple choice and short answer. Fair enough? Alrighty. So Jane, if we could switch to the computer, please. So today's topic starts our 5-week exploration of the public issue project topics. What we do in class over these next 5 weeks is not the public issue projects. It's just lectures about these general topics and their social problems. But the added part of what's going on in class for the next 5 weeks is the presentations of the discussion board, on the discussion board. So actually I'm going to myself switch over back to, here is the Brightspace page. You can leave me on the screen. You can leave me on, it's fine, Jane, thanks.
I like the way the discussion board is set up with Brightspace.
You like it?
I don't.
You don't like it? Oh, I know, yeah, with forums and topics and...
It's hard to navigate.
It takes a lot of clicking.
Yeah.
I agree. Sadly, I don't have a lot of control over it. I know you're not asking that, but... Yeah. So the way it'll work, right, is each week of the public issue projects, there's a forum dedicated to, or maybe a topic or whatever, but so for example, for age and aging, you click on that, there are 2 students who are doing age and aging for their topic this semester, and so they've each posted something to the discussion board about their topic. The goal is to post your thing, if it's your topic week, to post your thing by class time, right? So that we can look at it in class. I'm not gonna actually click on them and go into them. I'm just showing you how to do it. And so, as a student, and I'll repeat this at the end of the lecture, but sometime this week, you need to go in, even if you're a live student, go onto the discussion board, just see what your fellow students are posting, and give them some feedback. It doesn't have to be to every post. This week there's only 2, so it's not that hard to just go in and see what they've got. But if there were 10 posts or whatever, 1 or 2 is fine. For the authors of the posts, your job is to just check in every once in a while this week and, respond to any questions or, keep the discussion going. Does that make sense for now? And again, we're only doing age and aging this week. Next week, for anyone whose topic is the environment or environmental problems, you are going to want to make sure that your discussion is posted before next Thursday's class, the 28th, right? So try to post it by, Wednesday night. And then the same for the other ones. Now, as you can see, there are a few people who are posting early, right? That's okay too. Like if your topic is education and you know what you want to post about, you can post it now and just get it there, and then it's there. You don't have to worry about remembering to post it on time. So that's why there's some other stuff going on here. There's no requirement to look at these other ones yet. You'll do it during the week we talk about it, but it's okay to do it early if you feel like. All right, so that's the deal with the discussion board. I'll bring that up at the end when it fits in the lecture, but for now, I want to talk about age and aging. So in general, social scientists, not just sociologists, but psychologists and political scientists and human services social workers, people like that, tend to examine aging and age as what's called a life course perspective. So this is different from, let's say, biologists, right, or natural scientists who study like the process of aging in cells and things like that. What social scientists study is something called the life course perspective. It examines the entire course of a person's life from infancy through old age. So even though the title of the chapter today is Age and Aging, it doesn't just mean the elderly, right? All age groups are age groups that have different, pros and cons, or power or lack of power, or acceptance or non-acceptance in society. In general, the very young and the very old, like either end of that spectrum of age, tend to be the ones we focus on when we talk about inequality, because young adults through middle age, through maybe retirement age, are kind of the more normative age group. Like they're the ones that are sort of the default category. But even what those categories are, like I said, young adult, what's a young adult versus an adult, and what's pre-retirement versus elderly or whatever, all those stages of life are made up, right? They are social constructions. They are not biologically based. Biologically speaking, I suppose human beings have childhood or youngness, and then at some point we go through puberty, right, and become adults. And then at least women go through menopause and go on to a third stage biologically. But that's not what our age categories are, right? We've got teenagers and young adults and adolescents and middle age and all those things change, like what years we consider them to be. And all of those stages are socially constructed. They're made up. Did you know that adolescence didn't even exist before the Industrial Revolution? You were young, you were adult, right? That's why, like the bar and bat mitzvah in the Jewish faith happens at age 13, right? Before 13, you're a child. After 13, you're an adult in the eyes of the religion. There's no middle adolescent period. But what has happened is, after the Industrial Revolution and mass production of food and things like that, people have more free time than we used to, more leisure time. And children weren't expected to immediately have to start working on the fields and things like that across the country. I know they still do in places, and so suddenly there was this time period between, schooling or early schooling and actually having to go out and start doing something in the world, and that became what we now call adolescence. That being said, as I mentioned, so the very young and the very old tend to be the categories we focus on with aging in the life course, and specifically with aging in the elderly, the scientific study of that is called gerontology. Gerontology. I believe, but I won't die on this hill, I believe that gerontology was born out of sociology specifically, although of course it's interdisciplinary and includes elements of psychology and other disciplines. But it is, a social scientific study, not a biological. In biology and medicine, it's geriatrics, that's the term, right? But for the social aspects, it's gerontology. Any questions about these two terms, life course and gerontology? So the branch of sociology that gerontology comes out of is something called demography, right? Maybe you've heard of people talk about their demographics, right? Which are like your descriptors, your age, your I almost said date of birth, that's your age, your location, your gender, your whatever. Demography is the study of the size, composition, and distribution of populations. When you study a group of people and what they are made up of, right, that's demography. So, the easiest probably example would be the American population, right? The population of people in the United States. If you're studying how many there are, or what the composition is, the racial composition, the ethnic composition, the economic composition, the gender composition, and the distribution, like where everybody is. Any of those characteristics are demographic characteristics. And when it comes to aging specifically, right, we're talking about population aging. And so this is not one person getting older. This is when the proportion of older people grows in relation to the other age groups in a society. A population ages when the proportion of older people grows in relation to other age groups. So when I say older here, I put 60 to 65 plus, and the reason is because different entities measure differently. So like this, I don't remember who does what, but the World Health Organization uses one of these numbers, age 60 or age 65. Social Security uses 65, right? I think Medicare uses 60. So every, institution picks a different number, but it's somewhere in the 60 to 65 range and older. So like if you look at a breakdown of the U.S. population in the year 1820, so 200 years ago, the median age in the United States was 17. If you lined up everybody in the country in 1820, right, the person in the middle would be, by age, the person in the middle would have been 17. By 1900, 80 years later, the median age was 23. And then 100 years later, the median age in the U.S. was 35. What's going on here? So this is not about just one person getting older, but it's the fact that the average person or the median person is now older. What accounts for that? Why would our population be getting older as compared to 1820?
Lower birth rates plus higher life expectancy.
Right. Okay, I had to think of, yes,
Lower birth rate, higher life expectancy.
So, fewer babies, which means the fewer babies there are, the fewer people in the line at the end of the line where the young people are, right? Fewer babies being born, and at the other end of the line, people are living longer, right? So there's more people on the old end of the line. No offense to the line, but so yes, right? Both of those things are what's happening. There's not as many babies, and the babies that are born live longer, right? And so people live longer, and there's not as many children, bringing the age down. In fact, as some of you might have seen, in the 2020 census was the first year that the population overall was not increasing at the same rate as it has been. The birth rate was stagnant, I guess, in the U.S. For the first time in a long time. But that just means that there's not as many children. It doesn't mean that there's no babies. So how do we measure a population's age? I mentioned the word median here, right? That's where you line everybody up, and the person in the middle is whatever their age is. That's the median age. More commonly, we can measure, so median age is, I guess, the most common way to measure age, right? That's, as I mentioned, the midpoint of the range of ages in the population. So I said that, in 2000 it was 35 in the U.S. I'm not sure what it is in 2021, but I can tell you in 2018 it was 37. So here is a map, and I'll let you write down the midpoint in the range of ages of a population. So here is a median age by country. The highest median age in the world is in Japan, which is in stark contrast. So the average, or the median age, in Japan was 47.3. So of all the people in Japan, you line them up, right, person in the middle, 47. Remember, the U.S. was 38. In sub-Saharan Africa, places like Mali and Uganda, the median age was 15. So that's where these, much lighter countries are. So you can see that in the northern hemisphere, there's darker countries, right? Meaning people live longer, or at least the median. Sorry, not they don't live longer. The median age is older. And in Australia, but that in Africa, places in South America and Southeastern Asia, the median age is much lower. Sorry?
So like Iraq and Afghanistan, the reason why the population is so young is because all the adults were born.
Correct. So there are big shifts in population numbers, right? During wartime, during pandemics, right? The 1900 actually. During my intro class, there's this. You can see this map of the world with the population from the beginning of time until the year 2050. And when the bubonic plague was happening, you can see all the lights go out in Europe, because a huge portion of the population was dying. So yes, that's exactly true. This is 2018, so for the last 20 years, right, there have been huge war problems, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so those numbers are much lower. Pakistan, too, you can see, is not quite as dark, but anyway, so median age is one way we can measure age, right? Line everybody up and figure out what the middle age is in the range of ages of a group. But that's just one way to do it. Another way to measure the population's age is as a proportion, the proportion of the aged. That's the proportion of the population over a certain age. So the World Bank, their age that they pick is 65. Remember I said some are 60, some are 65. But and so according to the World Bank, the proportion of people in the U.S. over the age of 65 is about 15%, whereas in Japan, the proportion of people over the age of 65 is 27%. So many more people who are older are in Japan. Here's the United States. This is a terrible, terrible graphic for anyone who does data visualization because, these colors are totally random. There's no pattern here, right? No pattern at all. Yeah, right. It should be gradation, and even then, there's still not a recognizable pattern like north-south, whatever. So, however, I can point out, right, we know Maine is one of the oldest states, right, and orange, the orange that's not yellow but kind of is yellow, is the one that is the oldest, right? We have between 17 and 19% of our population is over 65, right? And some other states are around, Vermont, West Virginia, Florida, and Montana seem to also have a significant proportion, whereas the younger states are the bright yellow, right, where there's more younger people, or not more younger people, but fewer older people. Alaska, which to me makes sense because it's a very hardy place and it's not a comfortable place to just retire and hang out, right? Hence Florida, but, Utah and Texas would be the other two very young states. So that's another way of measuring age, right? The proportion of the population that's over 65. Finally, the third way that we can look at population age is through something called the dependency ratio. The dependency ratio is an economic measure. It's the number of people who are age 65 or 60, depending on who's measuring it, the number of people age 65 and older divided by the number of people of working age. Typically, working age is defined as either 15 or 18, somewhere in there, depending on the state, right? And then up through age 64, right? Because you can retire at 65. This is a quick way of generating estimates of like the demand on social resources like Social Security, right? Because if you have a lot of people of working age and only a few people who are retiring, right, then these people are paying into a system that can support these people, right? But when you get to a situation where there's more people who are drawing on resources than there are people paying into those resources, you can get into a trouble like we are facing with Social Security, which we'll talk about in a few minutes when we get to the actual problems. But does that make sense? So it's called a dependency ratio because it's measuring like economic dependence on people who are working. Does that kind of make sense?
Those numbers are going to be skewed because of disability, are they not?
Right, because disability could be people of any age.
Exactly. Someone who's of working age but not working is still going to draw on resources.
True.
So those numbers are going to be off, aren't they?
So they're not going to be off, but you're right that it is not a fully accurate portrayal of dependency.
It's not counting the people that are bringing, well,
Correct.
utilizing resources but are considered working age, so they shouldn't be.
Correct. It's only based on age, not working status. It's not based on whether you're drawing benefits or not, or so. Because it's meant to measure, it's actually a measure of age, not economics. It's okay that it doesn't.
Okay.
But you're absolutely right. If you truly wanted to capture what percent is drawing on resources and what percent is putting in, you have to account for that.
Okay.
But because it's a measure of age, it does also indicate a strain on the society, but it is not you're correct, it's not a perfect measure of that. But as a quick and dirty estimate of an age ratio, it is for that. Good question. So the way that we kind of visualize age in demography is something called a population pyramid. It's a visual representation of a society's age structure. And the cool thing about population pyramids is they can see the future. They can also tell us what to expect in the future, and I'll show you how in just a second. So I'm going to put a picture up that is not real. It's not representing any real data. It's just a demonstration of what a population pyramid looks like. So the way a population pyramid works is there's a vertical axis for age. So this is age 0, and this would be, 70, 80, 90 years old, whatever, higher ages up here. And the population is broken down by gender, men and women. So according to this picture, right, there are more children, of both male and female children, than there are, or infants than children, and more children than, teenagers, more teenagers than young adults, more young adults than adults, whatever, right? Each age range, it gets smaller. There's very few, 100-year-olds compared to how many babies there are. This is not what our society looks like, or any society really looks like. It's never that neat and tidy, but does the premise make sense? Gender and age, right? So here is an example of a population pyramid in the United States in the year 1900. So the first thing I want to explain is there's like this weird cap up here because they stopped measuring at age 60. And there were people that lived between age 60 and 100 back in 1900. There's not a lot of them, but when you add all of them into one category, it makes it look like there's a lot of them. So just ignore that cap there. As you can see, this is pretty similar to that first one I showed you, where there were a lot of women babies, a lot of male babies, and people would die eventually until, a certain age, right? Fast forward to 1940, right, during World War II. And as you can see, it looks different, right? Where now suddenly there's a few more young people, but not as many babies. Part of that is because the war was going on. People weren't having babies during the war because half the couple was away and, all that kind of stuff. But, as we know, once the war was over and GIs returned home and everything, there was what we call the baby boom, right? So if we fast forward to 1970, this is the baby boom, right? These are now people in their 20s, right? Because, if they were born in 1950 or whatever, by 1970, they'd be up here now in the pyramid. But you can see why we talk about it being a boom. There's a lot of people in this age range, right? Way more than in the previous age ranges, except during that time when, there were just not a lot of babies. Okay, so that's where the baby boom is. Now we'll go forward for 30 more years to the year 2000. The baby boomers have gotten older, right? But we still see them here. We still see that large population. Pretty soon, about 30 years from now, and we are 21 years from here, this group is going to be hitting retirement age, going to the other side of that dependency ratio, right? Suddenly they're not going to be working age anymore. Now they're going to be needing support, right? So the pyramid that I got this from this website doesn't project into the future, so I have to go to a slightly different one that uses a slightly different scale, but so it doesn't look as pronounced on this one, but the prediction is by 2030, right, this is what our population pyramid is going to look like, which isn't a pyramid at all. Because we aren't having lots of babies. There's not baby booms going on behind the baby boom generation. All the other generations have been fairly small, right? And so suddenly, now we have this column going on, right, where there's kind of equal amounts of people of every age. By the year 2100, it is predicted that we will have a completely smooth column. If anything, we'll have a tapered bottom with fewer young people, which is not what you want, because then how are they going to support all these people, right? Let me just put up one other visual version of this. So here is, and I did put a link to this on Brightspace. This is like a not real time, but an animated version of it. So it just keeps flipping. Hang on, right? That's the population size in the United States. And the year is up here, I think, yeah. So it tells you what each generation is. And so here's, you can see the baby boomers. And then they'll be down here. See how big they are, right? Going through. They're getting older and older and older. Here's Gen X, Millennial, Gen Z.
Well,
So
I feel like we have a generation of people who are we have children who aren't being cared for, who are in the system. My daughter, when I was pregnant with my youngest, was like, if you want to have a baby, why aren't you adopting a baby? There are babies who need moms.
Mm-hmm.
And I just feel like we have this generation of people who are so connected to that type of care that they're like, why are we having babies when we can go adopt a baby?
Yeah, I mean, so the demographic measure of that is called the fertility rate, like how many babies are born every year, and that has been decreasing. Yeah, so absolutely. And I had one other website, just visualizing. Whoa, what's happening there? Wow, it's like I'm using. I must be using the lockdown browser. Whoa, oh boy. Hold on, I just have to figure out how to drag it back over to my desktop. Sorry, guys. Oh. Hey, just kidding. I'm not going to show you the other one. The other one that I have a link to is you can manually choose what country across the world you're looking at and see their pyramid, and what year between 1950 and 2100 you want to see. So you can play with the data on that one. There is a link to it in the content section for today under special links from class or whatever. One second, I'm just making sure it's there. Yeah, it's there, okay. Okay, so back to the PowerPoint. Yeah, question?
Now, is there any prediction on the effect that the COVID numbers are going to have on that pyramid?
I am sure there are. I'm not up on that literature right now, but yes, absolutely. So COVID, we know, has disproportionately affected the elderly, right? Especially when it comes to fatalities. And so what we're going to see is a faster narrowing and a pointier top. What that means socially, is fewer people drawing on resources, but it also means more people who might have COVID and have long-term symptoms and need disability or other supports, right? People at other age groups are going to be drawing on the system more than perhaps they did in the past. That's my quick and dirty understanding of how it will affect, but I guarantee you there's demographers excitedly writing papers about the demographic effects of things in a not morbid way, but it feels a little morbid, right? They're just excited that something's happening demographically.
This is our time.
Yeah, look at us go. So earlier when I asked, okay, so why is it that people, the median age was 17 back in the 1800s and now it's 38? There were two answers, right? Like people have fewer babies and people are living longer. So that fewer babies thing, and to your point as well about, it seems like culturally there's, it's more acceptable to have fewer children, right?
It's like, excuse me, ma'am. Like, if I want to have a baby, I'll have a baby. It's like a little bizarre.
Yeah, but then again, right, like, back, in 1820 or even earlier, people had lots of children because they assumed
They were going to die.
Lack of birth control.
and lack of birth control, family planning, things like that, right?
They had a lot of purpose that they were going to die.
Correct. Like, if you, with a child mortality rate of 20%, right, if you had 4 to 5 children, the assumption is that 4 of them would make it to adulthood, but you might lose one. But even if you have 4 children, that doubles your population, right? 2 people have 4 kids.
Yeah, that's morbid. Maybe on
To play the odds, yeah. Well, and it's funny because most populations, when you ask them why they have so many children, they don't articulate that. They're not like, because I want to make sure some of them live. It's just what you do. That it's a cultural expectation more than it's a calculated risk.
Whereas now I think, like, the more children that I had, I was like, the higher risk that I'm going to have a child who's going to be diagnosed with cancer or struggle with something,
Oh, yeah.
I think that it shifts the way you think, I was like, do I really want to have another child and risk that I might have to suffer a loss? I think there is a shift for sure.
Yeah. And so this measure we call the fertility rate, not the mortality rate of children. That's the number of deaths, but just how many births are on average occurring per woman in the population. So if we have 330 million people in the U.S. and you can assume that about 170 million of them are women, right? How many births per woman every year? I don't know what the fertility rate is off the top of my head in the U.S., but that's that measure. The fertility rate in places like the U.S. or Europe is much lower. It's between 1 and 2, right, than in places like Mali and Sub-Saharan Africa, where the fertility rate can be between 4 and 5 or 5 and 6 pretty regularly. So there's big difference, although it doesn't feel like it in like a Western kind of country. There's big family here is 4 kids. That's a lot of kids in our society, but it isn't in others. The flip side of fertility rates is mortality rates. Mortality rates is the number of deaths that occur. Usually it's per 100,000 people in a population. It's not a percent. It's not per 100 people. It's per 100,000. Again, I don't know the mortality rate off the top of my head. But if a society has equal fertility and mortality rates, then that means the population won't grow or shrink. Right? For every person who dies, there's somebody born, and the overall population stays the same number. Population aging, though, so we're not just talking about the population, we're talking about how does the population get older as a whole. Population aging occurs when the fertility rates go down at the same time that mortality rates go down. And I'll give you a second because the logic there, it always takes me a second to calculate that, right? When there's fewer babies and when there's fewer deaths, that's that situation where you line everybody up. There's no babies on one end, but there's lots of old people on the other end, right? That is an older population as compared to one where there's lots of babies on one end and an average number of people on the other end, right? Fewer people have babies and more people live to older ages. There is one other factor that I'm not going to go into detail on about population aging. So, and this is true for all population growth. Birth and death is part of how population changes. Does anyone know what the other thing is that can affect a population size? the number of people in a place dying and moving, migration. Right, and so, migration also affects the size of a population and the age. Migrants, people who move from one population to another, tend to be younger. It's just, not as feasible for older people. Older people are more comfortable where they are, right? People escaping, like refugees and things, are often tend to be younger. So places that have a high level of immigration, people moving into the population, tend to be younger. Populations that have a lot of emigration, people leaving the place, tend to be older. But that's not nearly as big an effect as fertility and mortality, so I'm going to focus on those. But questions or comments about this? I know this is really high level, right? Because we're not talking about individuals aging and or not. We're talking about like the effects on the whole. So the big picture explanation for why are people having fewer babies and why are people living longer, therefore causing the population to age, right? The answer is something called the demographic transition, which is a fancy, phrase or terminology that describes population aging as a natural consequence of societal development. As we have developed societies over the last 3, 4, or thousands of years, right, but in particular over the last 200 years, there have been thorough advancements in things like sanitation, clean water, right, technology, and so more and more people, no matter where you live, are able to avoid fatal disease and live longer lives. Did you guys see, like 2 weeks ago, they finally developed a malaria vaccine? Like, not just a treatment, but a vaccine. That's huge for population. Like, that's going to change a lot of what the population pyramids in Africa look like. Because the mortality rate will be going down. Nobody's dealing with the fertility rate, right? That's still going to be really high, but the mortality rate will be going down because fewer people will be dying from malaria. But even if, the number one thing they argue, demographers argue that can increase the population is sanitation. That's the first thing. And then medicine, coming closely thereafter. But if you have access to clean water and you can get rid of waste safely, that almost instantly increases your life expectancy because of, you're avoiding things like cholera, diphtheria, and all these things that kill people very quickly. So as societies advance and develop sanitation, technology, etc., people live longer. And then eventually, once it kind of dawns on the population that everybody's living longer and you don't really need to have as big of families and that you don't need 8 babies or whatever, eventually the fertility rate also decreases. That tends to be associated with economic and social development. So eventually, people realize they don't need to have as many babies. I mean, if you have, both of my parents are baby boomers, and both of them came from families where they had 4 or 5 children, right? And just one generation later, right, my generation, my cousins and everybody, all have 2 or fewer children. Like in one generation, we kind of cut in half how many babies are being had. That's just my family. But the point is, right, eventually fertility rates go down. And especially when you compare them to, 100 years ago or whatever. Does that make sense? That relationship? Okay. So that brings us then to what are the social problems of aging societies? If you have a society that is going through population aging, which almost everyone on the planet is, even with migration, that can lower, the age of a particular population, most of them are aging, and part of that is baby boomers, but even worldwide, and that causes some problems. I want to focus on the U.S., but certainly, so a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about is like Social Security, that's U.S. specific, but it's similar in other Western countries. So the first thing is sustainability of entitlements. And if you're like me and you read that, it doesn't make, what does that mean? Entitlements is the legal term for the right to participate in programs according to government rules. So Social Security is an entitlement in our country. The VA is an entitlement program, right? Unemployment is an entitlement program. And the idea is the government decides what types of people are entitled to access Social Security. People over 65.
How can that be if we paid in?
Well,
If I
because
work
the
and
idea
I paid in, I'm entitled to it because it's mine.
is, there's a restriction on when you can access it, right? You're not supposed to access it until you're 65.
Or 62 if you want to get less money.
Yeah, okay, fair enough, right?
Yeah, but at
so-
60, I could collect on my husband that had died.
Yeah.
So I collected on him for 10 years, over $100 and some odd $1,000. Then, when I was 70, they switched to mine because his had drained as much as possible. So they switched to mine, which was higher at this point.
Right, because you were now 70 and not 62 or whatever, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you're right. It is your money in a sense, but it's called an entitlement because the government puts the restrictions on who is entitled or when they're entitled, right? So they say, okay, if you're 62 or 65 or whatever, that's who's entitled to draw on Social Security. If you are honorably discharged, I believe, right, from the military, that you're eligible for VA. There might be some little details in there, but for VA programs. If you left your job not of your own devices and you weren't fired, right, then you're eligible for unemployment, right? Like there's all these rules for who gets to have them. The point here is that, especially with Social Security, the more, when there's a lot of people over 65 in a population, that means a lot of people are going to be trying to draw on this program. And the program is at risk of insolvency. Solvency is when a program can deliver full benefits to its recipients in a timely manner. Everybody knows that the government can never do that, right? So there's always problems with a timely manner. But what we're seeing is the system was that young people pay in and old people draw from it. Well, it used to be that there were more young people than old people, so that was fine. Lots of money going in, only a little money coming out. But now we have a population that's aged, and so now there's fewer people putting money in and more people drawing from it. And so the Social Security system faces being insolvent because it can't deliver full benefits to all its recipients. Does that make sense? So here is a graph talking about life expectancy and showing why Social Security will be a problem. It's not just that people are living longer, it's not just that there are baby boomers. It's also that everybody is living longer. So people would draw on Social Security for 2 or 3 years before they died. Right? When the life expectancy was 67, people had Social Security and then they died. But now people are living well into their 80s, and so they're drawing on Social Security for 15 or 20 years. Right? Instead of, like you said, you exhausted one whole source, your husband's, and went on to another source. That wasn't expected when they started Social Security. And as you can see, this is until here, our actual data, and then these are estimates. That's why they're not as jagged. But that men and women are projected to live longer and longer lives as we go forward, meaning more and more people are just going to keep having to draw on Social Security, and there's fewer and fewer people who can pay into it. Does that make sense? And why that would be a problem for society, at least this one aspect? Another issue with an aging society has to do with the medical side of things. Right? Medical expenditures increase significantly because an aging population has more needs. For example, there's more of a demand for long-term care as people get older. Not everyone is quite as independent as Mimi is, right? Though it is admirable. And so the more older people there are, the more chances that people will need long-term care. As we all know, medical insurance rates go up, whether you are aging or not. The company, insurance companies kind of do the quick math and figure out everybody's getting older, they better raise costs. We know there's been a huge increase in both the usage of prescription drugs as well as the cost of prescription drugs. And other expenses like procedures and emergency room costs and things like that. The U.S. government, the DHS, estimates that the Medicare program, Medicare is the one that caters to people 65 and older, the Medicare program will run out of money by 2026. That's 5 years from now. Medicare will no longer be able to provide medical services for the elderly. We have to do something. This is a significant problem. I mean, Social Security is also going to be, dried out soon, but not as quickly as Medicare. And as we know, there's a huge demand for healthcare services. And because of that, government health insurance programs like Medicare, like Medicaid, and others are going to be very strained going forward. So that's a potential social problem. And I know I'm just setting up a bunch of problems and then moving on. We'll get to solutions at the end. I'm not, and that's true too, right, eventually. So the last thing I want to mention is the concept of something called critical gerontology. So I already mentioned gerontology is the study of age and aging socially. Critical gerontology is a theoretical approach, I guess, that questions our typical representations of later life. So we have stereotypes about the elderly, right? Just like we have stereotypes about everything. And critical gerontologists are really critical of the way that older persons are portrayed in culture, right? And they ask questions like, who benefits from mainstream narratives about the relationship between population aging and strained government services? I just spent 3 slides telling you that as we get older as a population, our services are going to be strained. That sure sounds like I'm blaming, doesn't it? When I make that presentation, hopefully you didn't think I was, but when I say, look, as the population gets older, government services are going to be strained. That is a narrative that the media and that the larger society makes them draw a connection in their brain between old people and bankrupting us, right? And that's a problem. Who benefits from that? Well, lots of people can benefit from that. The sustainability of social safety net programs relies on more than just population age. We know our population is getting older, and we know we can't really stop that from happening because aging is a thing that happens to everyone. So if we just say, oh, all these problems are due because people are getting older, and throw our hands in the air like, Chicken Little, the sky is falling, but don't do anything about it, and don't look at other causes, we're never going to solve the problem. The reason these programs are going to die, the programs are going to die, is not just because people are getting older. It's because our standards have eroded. It's because the efficiency of care is just terrible. It's because of there's high rates of medical over-treatment. Our current medical practices that encourage sick care instead of wellness and health care, right? Our local resources, all of those things vary significantly across the U.S., from state to state, from public to private, for all those kinds of variables play a role in how well services can be delivered to the population. And so, by switching to a pay-as-you-go healthcare system instead of a wellness and preventive care system, right, we are hemorrhaging money in our medical system. And then we blame it on the elderly, right? And we will talk about more about this when we get to we'll have a whole chapter on healthcare. That's going to be a riot. Just kidding. Yeah. So we will talk more specifically about healthcare, but the idea of critical gerontology is that, look, just because there's these narratives out there about the elderly and like particularly an aging population being a problem, doesn't mean that there's not other problems, right? Does that make sense? All right. So all of the things I've talked about so far have been at the macro level, right? The population level. That these are things that are problematic from a really abstract view. But on the micro level, on the individual level, right, we know that long-term caregiving, like families of people who are aging, can be very financially and psychologically demanding. There's, the material help that people need, like assistance paying bills. There's instrumental help that people need. Things like, just housekeeping or running errands becomes much more difficult, right? Informational help. Literally, aging populations need more information or emotional support. When seniors need information about health or technology or something, right, it can be very important for, a family member or caregiver to provide that assurance or support, right? And so there are a lot of these needs that are not just affecting the elderly, but also affecting caregivers as well. Questions or comments about these social problems related to aging and society? All right. So the last thing I want to talk about, and then we'll take a break in a few minutes, is the overall idea of inequality when it comes to aging. So I am specifically talking about the older end of our spectrum here. Not that there aren't also issues with children and various social problems that they face, but we're going to have a day on the family, and some of that is children. So we will get to them as well. But there are lots of sociological factors that influence our experiences of aging. The way that you age and the way that you experience aging is very different depending on where and how you live. Factors such as political or economic contexts, a person's socioeconomic status, their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, all of those things can play a role in how a person ages. You remember the term intersectionality? Right, that, race doesn't exist in a vacuum, gender doesn't exist in a vacuum. All of these things interplay with one another, including age. So what I'd like to do is kind of point out some of these social problems that we've talked about already this semester and how they are uniquely affecting the aging population. So for example, we talked about poverty during like week 2 or something in this class, right? But specifically how poverty relates to aging. So, just a quick piece of history. The Social Security Act, the thing that instituted Social Security, occurred in 1935, and after being implemented, it reduced the rates of poverty, right? It was, the goal of Social Security was to address the fact that many people who were elderly were in poverty and could not survive because of money, not because of health-related issues, right? And so Social Security was a way of supporting people after they retired so that they could still have income, and it reduced rates of old age poverty. Then, in 1972, they tried to adjust Social Security for inflation. And so before, like in 1967, before that it changed, about 30% of U.S. adults over 65 were in poverty. By 2016, by a few years ago, less than 10% of the aged population lived below the poverty line. However, that's a general aggregation of all elderly people, and when you look at racial and gender minority groups, you see a huge discrepancy, right? People of color and women, especially women who live alone who are elderly, have much higher poverty rates than whites or married couples or men who live alone, right? So unmarried or older adults, women, and racial and ethnic minorities tend to be poorer. And as you can imagine, the highest rates of elderly poverty occur among unmarried Hispanic women who live alone. They're the group that has the largest poverty rate. 41% of older Hispanic women who live alone are in poverty. So that's a big issue that needs to be addressed. Poverty in general needs to be addressed by society, but specifically the poverty of the elderly is something that we can see patterns in. And when you see patterns, that suggests a structural problem. And the good news about structural problems is they can be solved with structural solutions. The bad news about structural problems is they have to be solved by structural solutions, which are very hard and time-consuming to get in. Questions or comments about poverty and age for now? All right, why don't we take a break here? When we come back, I'll talk more about some of the social problems, discrimination and all that kind of stuff facing the elderly. Then we'll talk about some solutions and responses that society can make. And then we'll wrap up with an activity today about the life course. And I'll send you all to the discussion board. So we'll meet back here, let's say 10 after 2, 2:10. All right, see you all in a few minutes. Welcome back, everybody. Apologies if I cough again. I was just coughing on the break. But so we were talking about inequality in society, race, class, gender things, but how they are playing out in aging populations as well. Oh my goodness. Okay. So we can switch back to the PowerPoint. Another issue faced by people in general is discrimination. But when we're talking specifically about aging and discrimination against people who are aged, there are a couple theories for this. So there's something called the modernization theory of aging, which says that the status of older people declines as a society shifts from agriculture or away from agricultural modes of production, right? As a society, in a traditional society, in a agricultural society, older generations had high social standing because of their expertise and their experience in those fields, literally in the fields. But in contemporary settings, people often associate technological proficiency with youth, right? And so the value of being older is seen or constructed to be lower.
I don't think it's just agriculture. I think it's how things advance. So if technology as a whole is advancing quickly, then as you get older, your expertise becomes you. But if technology advances slower, then your expertise still holds value.
Fair.
So
the rate of
how
modernization.
Advancing. So even if it's agriculture or not, it's just agriculture just was slower. That's the only reason why it couldn't advance past a certain point until we got to really current technology coming back. But
that's fair. I think that's fair. Yeah.
I think just saying agriculture in general is not really true. I think it's the modernization as a whole. The speed of modernization affects how valuable they are, or how much the older population involves themselves in the modernization.
Right.
In Japan, they really honor their elders, and they have a lot of expertise still in the working field because they constantly are teaching, learning the new technology and getting involved, whereas America, not as often.
No, that's fair. For context, the theory, the modernization theory of aging is written post-agricultural during the industrial era. And so there wasn't necessarily an envisioning of faster, but I hear you, and I agree with you. So it was originally written as away from agriculture into industrial. But I think your point is well taken that the shift from industrial to technological, which has occurred much more rapidly, right, we see it much more significant, much less, faster, right, much more significantly. And so, there can be situations where the views of the elderly are dismissed as obsolete or less important, right? But if it's done, more carefully.
What was the senator that said?
Oh, what's the Facebook?
The Insta accounts?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, what's a Finsta? Yeah, that's right, yeah. Yeah, we laugh at them because they're ridiculous and out of touch, and how can you write laws about technology that you don't understand? That's, side issue. That's not discrimination. That's just someone being qualified for a job.
I was kind of awesome as well.
Anyway, so speaking of being annoyed at, discrimination, right? So the term for this, as you probably are aware, is ageism, just like racism is discrimination based on race. Ageism is discrimination based on age. I suppose it is possible to be ageist and discriminate against younger people, but we tend to think of ageism as being discrimination against older people. Although, you know what, I will say, like, teenagers are often discriminated against just based on their age, right? And certainly very young people have zero power in society, and so that's sort of a form of discrimination as well. But on the older end of the spectrum, right, we're facing things like stereotyping. Stereotypes can affect older adults' ability to find employment or receive fair treatment, even with laws that are meant to protect those things, right? Ageism or age-related discrimination is included and forbidden in equal opportunity employment and things like that, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. Everybody knows in The Office the episode where Creed, dyes his hair black and tries to pretend he's 30 years old or whatever. And, we all know that doesn't necessarily work. Not to mention, there's a particular overlap here of ageism and sexism that goes on. As women age, because women's value is more appearance-based in our culture, their value decreases more quickly as they age, because arguably your appearance, by society standards, declines over time. Whereas men's societal value tends to be more performance-based, and that can be affected by age, but not nearly as much as appearance is affected by age. And so this is sometimes seen as like a double standard of aging, right, where women are hit twice as they age, both as being old and as being less attractive as a woman, whereas men are, certainly when they age, they're older, so they're discriminated against, but not necessarily on their appearance or their performance. Like Hollywood, absolutely. How many, 50-year-old leading men are paired with 25-year-old leading women, right?
I would like to see someone say that Meryl Streep is
True. Exactly, but you'll never see her cast opposite a 20-something-year-old.
No.
Where you'll see George Clooney have it happen every movie he's in.
Fair.
True.
Fair. And,
A woman, when she ages, is told she looks old, but as a man ages, they're told they look distinguished.
ooh, there you go, right? Yeah, silver fox and all that, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so, overt discrimination, obviously a social problem, right? That's one thing. There's also this effect on people, though, when you are the victim of discrimination, right? You can internalize it. And in the case of ageism, there's internal ageism, where elderly people subscribe to negative stereotypes of elders. Self-deprecating jokes, oh, I'm just an old person, I don't understand technology. My mother does this all the time, and she is over 65, and she just assumes that everyone thinks she's an idiot when it comes to technology. Is she the most well-versed in technology? No. She doesn't know what Finsta is either, but she's not a senator trying to write laws about it. But she, you know, when I say, oh, Mom, have you seen this meme or whatever, she'll be like, oh, no, I don't understand things. You know I can't do those. I don't know what you mean. She's internalizing the fact that I just assume she's clueless, right? Do you know what I mean? So.
You know what these memes are?
Yeah, what's a meme? Right. But, you know, so that they're internalizing these attitudes, and then it can result in, you know, negative self-concept, right? Not to mention, this is true for any group in society, right? People over the age of 65 are treated as a homogenous age group, like as though they're all the same, but they're not. And every age group knows this, right? All teenagers are, you know, treated like they're all the same, and they're not.
Damn kids.
Those, yes, always on my lawn. But, you know, by lumping these groups together, right? I know 65-year-olds that are frail and you know, could be on death's door, and I know 100-year-olds that are still powering through, you know, more energy than I have, right? So, like, to speak about people in an age category as all being the same is just as flawed as speaking about all black people or all women or whatever. But there's a lot of the stereotyping and lumping of older folks into a homogenous group. Finally, intergenerational conflict. So there is a lot of infighting, I guess it's not infighting, but fighting amongst the generations, right? So generations, we refer to in demography as cohorts. They are birth cohorts, people born roughly around the same time. Baby boomers are a birth cohort. Millennials are a birth cohort, right? And there is conflict between groups. There always has been. There's another example. Things that have always happened and we pretend like they're new right now, right? And the types of conflicts have always been the same as well. They're work-related. Either you're draining or you're lazy, you know, one or the other, right? You ruined the culture for us, you know, or whatever, or, you know, your generation is going to destroy all the things that we did, or whatever, right? And so generational equity is the concept that different generations should have access to similar resources and opportunities in society. It's equity here, not equality. Generational equity, the concept that different generations should have access to similar resources and opportunities, not identical resources and opportunities. It makes sense that increases in expenditures for resources on older aging programs might be a point of concern for younger people because they don't see it as, you know, being equitable, right? Well, why do they get something that I'm not getting? But when you look at it as a society, right, the society benefits by lifting up those that need that support. And so really the best way to think about it is that intergenerational conflict overlooks the extent to which generations are interdependent. The millennial generation couldn't exist without the boomers, first of all, like genetically and biologically speaking, but also the baby booming generation could not survive past where they are now without the support of the millennial generation, and vice versa, right? These are interdependent. To the extent that our parents and grandparents might be receiving income from Social Security or getting some other kind of senior-focused community program, right? We as the younger generation, experience less need, right, to draw on those kinds of resources, or financial or non-financial resources, right? I don't have to assist my parents because our social programming is assisting them, right, or to some degree. And so, to think about how the different generations are related is a more important and holistic way than just saying it's us versus them all the time, right? So, questions. So these are all different kinds of inequality: discrimination, poverty, intergenerational conflict, and so on. But that doesn't mean that everything is terrible all the time, always. There are people working and ideas and social theories that can help us respond to the fact that our population is aging, and that it will likely continue to age, because even once the baby boom generation, even once our population pyramid kind of becomes a column, right, we're still going to face aging-related issues. They're just going to be different ones, right? There's not necessarily going to be because of a glut. But policies that are good for society as a whole help the elderly. And vice versa. Policies that are good for the elderly help society. Right? It's part of that interdependence idea that it isn't taking away from you to help someone else. It can rise, what is it, rising tide? No, incoming tide raises all boats, whatever it is, Everybody gets a benefit. One potential solution, so we talked about like Social Security and Medicaid and things like that reaching insolvency, not being able to fund what they're meant to do. One solution that's been posed and implemented at least once in my lifetime is increasing the retirement age as a way to safeguard policy solvency. So if you increase the retirement age, they increased it from 55 to 60 at one point, and I believe from 60 to 65 at one point. And the idea is that reduces the number of people who are drawing on that service, right? Now, it does mean that people have to wait longer, and they might struggle more before they get to that retirement age. But it's one way that we've kind of tried to address, this issue of solvency. The other thing we've done with relation to retirement is to expand people's retirement options. There is the traditional retirement where you remove yourself from the labor market entirely, right? I'm done working. But there's been an increase in phased and partial retirements. Phased retirement is where a person reduces the number of their hours, but they continue to work. So they might go part-time, right? Or they might work, 30 hours instead of 40, or 10 hours, or whatever. And then there's also something called partial retirement, which permits people over the age of 65 from receiving benefits even while they're still working part-time. So that you don't have to fully retire to start drawing on those benefits. You do have to engage in phased retirement, drop down to part-time, but then you can start drawing on at least some of those benefits. So these are ways we've tried to both,
Can you draw on benefit? No, sorry. Can you draw on benefits on the phased retirement?
Yes.
And
Then it becomes partial. Yeah. So phased retirement means dropping your hours, and then if you want to draw on benefits with those dropped hours, you go to partial. Does that make sense, Tanya?
Yeah.
Kind of.
And
Kind of, yeah.
You can be on phased and not get benefits right away, or you can be on phased and draw benefits, but then we call it partial.
but it used to be
Yes, Mimi.
that for every $2 that you made, if you're 65 and you worked it and you are drawing, you had to pay back $1. 50% would go back.
Right.
After 65, you can make as much as you want.
Right.
They don't take money out. It's
Right.
yours.
So right, you don't get access to everything immediately, but you can at least kind of balance still working some benefits.
Like I can make another $70,000 a year, and I don't have to pay back to Social Security.
Okay. Yeah.
I will pay in, but not back. Used to be that you had to pay back.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And right, so they reduce the payback amounts or requirement as well. Yes.
Yes, requirement.
And you still have to work for an employer that supports this, right? Not everybody can just automatically partially retire from, every industry all the time. There's I don't know all the details, but there are, the Social Security Administration has rules for these things, but they can happen. Excuse me. Other questions about retirement? Oh, yeah.
Second careers.
You mean, okay, so, like, after full retirement, moving on,
Retired and now
and they pick up a new career. So I don't believe if you have retired and you start a new career, I don't believe you pay into retirement after that. So I don't think you're eligible, but I I'm not gonna, consider myself an expert on that, so I'm not sure. And I don't know what happens when you're working 2 jobs and how that plays out either. Or part-time work, in addition to full-time. So I just know from like traditional 40-hour full-time work, these are your kinds of options. That is a good question, but I don't know. Okay, so another issue we had talked about before the break, or maybe right after we got back, but was healthcare, right? And the healthcare system and its strain and everything based on aging population. The healthcare systems and research in healthcare are adapting to the fact that they have recognized that we have an aging population and are doing as much as they possibly can, maybe in the system that we have. For example, and this became really noticeable during the coronavirus pandemic, which is an increase in the use of remote technologies. And in a state like Maine, this is a huge improvement to healthcare for the elderly in rural and remote areas. Right, so this is, being able to have a telemedicine, meeting with your doctor, right, or being able to, there's even ways to, monitor people's vital signs and blood pressure and stuff remotely, and that kind of thing. Not only does that technology allow people to stay home and be reached where they are, it decreases the amount of time they spend in hospitals or medical facilities where they could possibly catch something and get sick. And it helps older adults avoid having to go to nursing homes or assisted care facilities if the care level they need can be achieved with a remote technology. Additionally, there's been a significant increase in funding for research on 2 age-related illnesses, and they are themselves related: dementia and Alzheimer's disease. It's a very high priority in the medical field. It is one of the highest funded research areas after cancer and probably erectile dysfunction, but I'm not sure. That one's a big moneymaker. But anyway, Alzheimer's and dementia have they've done a good job of marketing the problem such that people are paying attention to it, right? And so money for research is maybe not plentiful, but obtainable. And these, of course, are illnesses that primarily affect the aged. Some societies so one way to reduce, remember how if you line everybody up, an aging population means more older people and fewer babies? Some societies have taken that to mean, so if we want to lower our population's age, we should encourage people to have more babies. And anybody who knows about demography is horrified by that, but it is a thing that happens, right? There are things that are called pro-natalist policies. Pro meaning for, natal meaning born. Pro-babies being born. Pro-natalist policies attempt to address population aging by encouraging people to have more children. There are places that give what are called baby bonuses, where couples are given a bonus from the government for having a child. Places that offer or mandate paid parental leave make having children more attractive and better, right? Offering the right to work part-time improves people's likelihood of having children. Providing annual paid time off, increasing affordable child care options, and subsidizing fertility treatments are all things that have been done under the pro-natalist umbrella. Yes, it does, if you're a pro-natalist, it does mean overall population increase is still a big problem. These things tend to happen in places without large populations. So a lot of European countries, especially ones where there's a lot of emigration, people leaving, have tried to do this to shore up their own populations. I think Finland is one of the places that has pro-natalist policies. I know they have the baby boxes, to help people.
Most of Japan did it too.
I think
because their age is so old.
Correct. Japan, I would not be surprised at all to hear that Japan has some pro-natalist policies.
I think they have.
Right. Yes. And so, right, we were just talking about how the whole world population is too big and growing too fast, and so it sounds like this is a bad plan. It's a little bit more micro of a plan, like in pockets, trying to increase fertility, but either way, it is a problem. And I think I'll try to find it, and if I do find it, I'll post it in the links folder on Brightspace to commercials from places that are trying to get people to have children. Like, they're hilarious.
Like that.
Yeah, so I know I've seen them on like BuzzFeed or Facebook or somewhere, but if I find them, I'll put them in the links folder because they're crazy. It's your duty, right? Okay, so we also, we talked about how one of the problems is, caregiving can be very draining and hard for families, right, who have aging members. And so to improve on that, we need to increase our programs and support for families who are caring for elderly relatives. 29 of the 50 states in the United States have what are called filial responsibility laws. Filial means child or son, I think technically, but child responsibility laws, meaning you are responsible for your parents just as they were responsible for you when you were underage. Right? So just like you could be arrested for child endangerment, you can be arrested for parental endangerment after a certain age, right? So some states, I don't know if Maine is one of them. I think it is. But also in other countries around the world have Japan definitely has filial responsibility laws. Some places have enacted looser or more open immigration policies. I mentioned before that immigration tends to lower population aging. Immigration can mitigate population aging as well as expand the workforce. Most people who immigrate are of working age, or they have children who will become of working age, eventually. And so it is a double benefit to have immigration in a population because it lowers the population's age and provides more workers. But of course, we know that immigration policies and visa policies all depend on a whole web of demographic and political pressure. And it's easy to say that immigration can mitigate population aging and expand the workforce, but there are also potential issues, with immigration as well. So, trying to get people services that they need, and if they are asylum seekers, to make sure that they go through the right processes and all that kind of thing. Tanya, I see your hand up. Oh, maybe not.
Maine does not have the filial law, but New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Vermont do.
Aha, thank you. Did you Google? Because that's perfect.
I did. I was very curious on that. Because I think, I don't know, to me it's kind of ethical that you would take care of your parents.
Yeah.
So the reason I say I would argue against it is there's a lot of parents that, I would say some kids grew up in abusive homes and would not want to take care of their parents or be fiscally responsible for parents that literally maybe wasn't even in their lives, and suddenly they come back when they're 60, 70, 80 years old and they're like, hey, take care of me.
Fair.
Fair enough, yes, true.
And to tie it to your point, right, the reason there aren't laws in a lot of places is because the social pressures, the moral and ethical messages are that you should do that. These, tend to be in places maybe perhaps where that isn't enough to sort of help that along. But fair point to Garnet as well that
You would think New Hampshire says it best when they say live free or die.
they really mean that.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say, I don't think Japan actually has.
No, they don't need them.
Because they don't need exactly. Their culture wouldn't even think of not taking.
It would be offensive, right, to require it. Yeah, fair.
Sean, if you did take care of your family.
Mm-hmm. And in that culture too, abusive or not, arguably is
They're still required to take care of them.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And like I said, I don't know exactly who does and who doesn't, but I can see that argument. And so I think the legal measures come in when the social measures cannot do the work. Let's see, I don't remember if this is last, but not least. But so another one is rural communities. So rural communities are much more likely than urban communities to experience extreme population aging. That's because rural communities are smaller populations. So every single person who comes or leaves is going to have a big effect on the age of the population. And the older we get, the more likely we are to become place-bound, to want to stay where we are. And so people in rural communities, once they are older, they're not going to move, right? And they're certainly not going to move into a city if they live their whole lives in a rural area, right? Young adults tend to leave places, but older people don't. Young adults leave en masse for jobs or education. I don't have to explain this to Mainers. We know this even as a state, right? We have a huge, emigration, people leaving the state of young adults, right? But when that happens, as we know, local businesses can fail, the tax base shrinks, and the general economic health of the area may decline. So in places in Maine, not only do we have like industries declining, like mills closing, or industries like timber, being less than they once were, we also have this extreme aging going on where young people are leaving because of the no mills and no work and all that, and not coming back. And then it leaves these places to sort of decay. So there is a huge movement in like municipal politics to try to attract younger people to areas. This isn't a super rural area, but Gardner, Maine, right? There's a Gardner Main Street, and they're trying to be really appealing to younger families. This is a fun little town, and you can open a business, and you can send them to a good school, and we're all a community, and right, that kind of thing. Trying to get younger people to come to the area. What we find is that three things are the most important factors in attracting younger families. Affordable housing, which is the problem everywhere, and so that's why nothing's working right now. The second is high-quality school systems. We'll get to that next week, or maybe the weekend, whatever week we're doing education. We'll talk about the problems with that. And believe it or not, public outdoor amenities. And this is like even before the pandemic. Public outdoor amenities are somehow the third most highest factor characteristic of an area that draws younger people. If you've got parks, if you've got trails, if you've got pools, stuff for your kids to do, and stuff for you to do as a family, right? That becomes, and stuff that's not just a mall or whatever, right? Brings families in, and so there's a lot of push for financially struggling communities to try to bring younger people so that they can in turn have the money as a community to provide adequate services for the other side of the aging spectrum. And that brings me to a concept that I hear a lot about when people talk about aging in society. And it's the idea of aging in place. Has anyone ever heard that phrase before? Or maybe it's just in the academic world, but aging in place. Aging in place is the idea that we should allow people to age where they want to be. And so adapting physical and social environments so that older adults can remain in their own homes and avoid relocating. Obviously, people with significant medical issues that need round-the-clock kinds of care may not be able to stay in their own home. But there are a lot of things that society can do, not families, not on the micro level, but society itself can do to try to increase the ability for adults to remain in their homes. And there are two social psychological theories that support this. They're called continuity theory and activity theory. So continuity theory says that as we age, a continuation of both our internal structures, like our personality, and our external structures, like our relationships, promote life satisfaction. As we age, being able to continue our internal structures and our external structures promotes satisfaction. We are happier when we can maintain what we are already doing, our personal internal processes and our relationships. The other theory is called activity theory, and it says that older adults are happiest and healthiest when they stay active physically and mentally and when they are involved in social networks. Again, I don't think logically this is a surprise. These theories have made their way into the mainstream over time. Maybe not by name, but we know that staying active both physically and mentally can promote well-being. And so if you combine them, staying active and engaged is important, and being able to continue your lifestyle is important. Then providing a world where people can age where they want to be and continue to participate in the world is a good thing, rather than locking them away in a group home or something like that, right? And so communities are increasingly developing what are called age-friendly spaces that support and enable seniors to age in ways that optimize opportunities for later life health, participation, security, and quality of life. So, for example, when a new park is designed, does it need to have steps everywhere, or could there be ramps? When a facility, it doesn't just have to be ADA stuff either, but, when new, like transportation, say there's a new bus system, right, that gets developed, if there's ways to make sure that it stops at places that are important to the aging community, right, as opposed to just stopping at the mall and at the, grocery store or whatever, like, trying to incorporate ways that optimize opportunities. Hang on, I have more on the next slide that kind of illustrates this somewhere. Oh, it'll be on the next one, sorry. So some examples of this are things like housing, social participation, you don't have to write all these down, transportation, community support and health services, all of these things that create age-friendly environments. You don't have to write this down. This is the World Health Organization's image. This is what I was looking for. And they have all these, the 8, leaves in a age-friendly city. Civic participation, respect and social inclusion, community support services. I'm not going to test you on these, but this is a movement in city planning, in urban renewal, and in rural development, economic development for Gardner, Main Street, and all those kinds of places, trying to improve economic situations to attract younger people while also being friendly to their existing aging population. Does that make sense? There's things like universal design and architecture that somehow, and I don't know how this stuff works exactly, but architecture that's more welcoming and that kind of thing too. So, to summarize, right, the sociological perspective and basic knowledge about population aging both play a role in preparing a community for an aging society. Right? As we design and create and interact with others in our daily lives, being aware of the fact that our population is aging can help shape those age-friendly environments, right? So being aware of population aging and being aware of the sociological explanation for it. The perspective and basic knowledge of population aging can also help us understand why resources might be unequally available. What we know about the social forces affecting the elderly can also help us support our older family members, right? And ourselves as we age. Because I hate to break it to all you youngins, but you're going to get old too, right? And it sucks. Especially the day you realize that you kind of flipped from being on the earlier side of things to the later side of things. I don't know if it's age 40 or what, but it will happen. And so being aware of this is important now and in the future. And finally, it allows us to appreciate how the well-being of all generations is linked together. It's inextricably linked. We are interdependent. If you give up on one generation and write them off, the society will crumble, right? All the generations and all the parts of society have to play a role for society to work. And that includes all age cohorts.
So I think one thing, I think aging in place is one of the big parts, but the also, the other one, just increasing age in general, is you're talking about getting younger people to move in because of affordable housing.
Yeah.
Well, that's why you don't have affordable housing.
Right.
Because you're aging in place. They're not leaving their homes, or they're either passing it on to their children or selling and going to younger generations.
Right.
So it creates a housing
That's
crisis.
it, yeah.
And I think this is where that animosity between the generations comes from.
Yeah, tension.
Well,
Yeah.
especially now, because it feels like baby boomers got a lot, because of how the demographics work, there's a lot more opportunity.
Sure.
And now they're saying, well, now we want to age in place. We want to stay here. We want this. We want that. We want this. So it feels like now they're like, well, we're older. Now we still get everything. And you guys are still struggling to get a house.
Right.
You're still struggling to do this. You're struggling to do that as a younger generation. So it feels unfair to some of the younger generations. And that's why some of them, there were some of that generational
Right.
tensions coming from.
And it doesn't feel unfair. It is unfair.
It
I
is
mean,
unfair.
it's objectively unfair, right? That is true. Yeah.
And so it feels, from a standpoint, I can see where that animosity comes from. And, I get wanting to change things and improve things as time goes on. But it feels like there's such a pressure right now to, let's just do it right away. We got to do it now.
Yeah.
But
Well,
people are still not getting homes.
Yeah.
People are still, and it's like, why is it this generation's the one that we have to fix everything for them, and then leave us to sit there and not have homes?
Right.
And I feel like that's why the millennials and some even the Gen Z are a little bit more frustrated with the aspects of
Excuse me.
with the aging population.
I think that's a very reasonable explanation for the source of some of that animosity, and I think it raises the point that like nobody chose to be born in the period that they were born in, right? And so it's so hard to separate these population level trends that are causing these problems with the individual people who are part of those groups, right? Like I understand that the baby boom generation as a generation, no individual people in it, but just is causing some of these problems. The fact that we had a huge generation, whenever it happened, right? So trying to separate the population level issues from the individual level hurt is very difficult, right? And I agree with you. I think that's why we see a lot of this.
That the media on top of it
Sure.
writes articles every day that, this is millennials are lazy, or millennials are the fault for this,
Correct.
or the fault for that.
And that's because, right, who were the journalists while the millennials were in their 20s, who were in their 30s and 40s, right? Gen X to a degree, and baby boomers, right, who were benefiting at the time. So, yeah, I am interested to see in another 10 years or whatever, who are the millennials going to start picking on, and then who are Gen Z going to pick on? I mean, there's always going to be somebody, right? I don't know what it'll look like, but
It's Gen Alpha.
is it Gen Alpha? Okay.
And everybody seems to be focusing on that now.
All right. But they're like 10.
But you also got to take Gen X kind of out of the equation because we just hate everybody.
Yeah. The misanthropic generation, they see it as it.
I just slipped into millennial.
Yeah.
Just the beginning, and I
And
was
Gen
raised
X.
like more like a Gen X.
Yeah.
Because my bad race.
Yeah. And there's also much bigger of a blurring, I think, generationally, because the baby boomers were like 20 years, right? And so some of them who had babies right away, that makes sense. But then some of them didn't have babies till the 80s, and yeah, it's messier, I think. Maybe it's because it's the generations we belong to, and maybe it's just always messy. I don't know. Like, I should ask my parents, like, did you have a really strong sense that you were a different generation, but.
I mean, it might be also just because of the urbanization, too.
True.
We have to deal with each other a lot more, whereas before, you said first off, generations were dying off.
True. There was no like 65 plus generation because everyone only lived to 50 or whatever, but yeah, that's true too. So, though I tried to present some solutions, certainly don't think we've solved anything. Apologies to the world, but this course is social problems, not social solutions. So, at least we know the sense of where the problems are coming from, hopefully, and it can inform us. To that end, I want to remind you of the discussion board and the things that your fellow classmates have posted. So in this week's folder, you can access the discussion board right here, Age and Aging, or you can go through assessments and discussions. And as I mentioned, there are 2 posts this week from Taylor and Mimi, so thank you to Taylor and Mimi for your posts. Everyone will take a look at those and, comment to you this week. Try to do it by next class, everybody, so that next class we can move on to the next topic. And last but not least is our activity for today, our participation assignment. And this is a reflective assignment. It's just you thinking about your life. So hopefully it's not too bad. Let me put it on the PowerPoint instead because it's easier to read, I think. So basically what you're going to be asked to do is to think of some transitions that mark steps from childhood to adolescence, or from adolescence to adulthood, or adulthood to old age. Like, what are the, getting your driver's license. That's like a thing that marks maybe your adolescence to adulthood age, or something, some rite of passage, or something like that. It could be something you went through yourself in your generation, or it could be something you were told about by parents or other relatives that they went through, right, that kind of thing. And so that's the gist of the assignment. Where did it go? So what it asks you to do is to describe the ritual, the transition, right? How is it public? Is it private? Describe a major historical event, describe a major event or historical development that has happened in your lifetime, and speculate on how it affects people your age. So again, that, everybody in my parents' generation talks about where they were when JFK was shot, right? People in Gen X often talk about September 11th. Now, people talk about maybe where they were for coronavirus, whatever, right? The big event that affected a generation. And contrast how this event affected your age cohort, your generation, with people in earlier cohorts, right? And did it affect people in the same way or differently, and that kind of thing. Does that make sense? So it's purely reflective. It's just about your experiences and your understandings. If you want to talk to somebody of another generation to get their input, that would be awesome, but it's not required. Any questions about that assignment? It should not take you too long. It shouldn't be terrible. A few sentences for each bullet that I ask. So there's the worksheet and the discussion board. That's your homework for next time. Sound good? Any questions or concerns? So next time is the environment.
Okay, so that's it for this. This is just talking now about next week.